we had a couple of longtime, well-established coaches step away from the game in a way today, CA, and both of them, oddly enough, 72 years of age. Early on in the day, we saw, and I know that I think I saw it from Adam Schefter reporting, but it was the announcement that the Seattle Seahawks will no longer be coached by Pete Carroll after 14 years
dun, dun, dun.
and 10 playoff appearances in the franchise's only Super Bowl championship as well. And under his tenure, team owner Jody Allen announced that they were going to mutually agree for him to no longer be the head coach, right? And so he is now going to step into an unspecified role with the organization, which means it feels like they're giving him a soft landing. And I read that originally. I thought of it as sounds like he's kind of ready to step away at 72, like he's been doing this a long time.
He didn't say that last week.
No, he didn't, and he also in his farewell conference he agreed. He mutually agreed to set on a new course conversation. But he also said that he competed pretty hard, quote, to remain the head coach, and ultimately, quote, went along with their intentions. So it does seem like the organization looked up and was like, "Hey, this might be a good time to make that move after a 9-8 season." So there's that, but then there's also news that felt like it dwarfed this one.
It did.
As later on, we found out that Nick Saban, one of the best, if not the best, college football coaches in history, won 7 national championships, turned Alabama back into a national powerhouse. He ultimately said that he is going to retire, saying that Alabama has been a special place for him and Miss Terry, his wife, and that they've enjoyed every minute of their 17 years there and becoming part of the Tuscaloosa family, but, now he is moving on. And so, I'm interested from your perspective, which one of these hit you the strongest? Was it Nick Saban stepping away or Pete Carroll doing so?
Well, the order was put like this. Pete Carroll better be glad his announcement came first because it got dwarfed immediately. Nick Saban, that story is now not just the biggest story in football, it's the biggest story in sports. There's nothing else to talk about today. It dwarfs it all because he's up there. Like you said, he's arguably the greatest college football coach in history. I mean, all you do is look at his resume. And the fact that he took his last team to the college football playoffs showed you he's relevant. They only lost 2 games. They lost to Michigan last weekend in the semifinal, and Texas knocked them off. So Nick Saban, and again, we're talking about a coach that competed in the SEC, which is arguably the best conference, top to near bottom, in college football. So what, like, oh yeah, he won all these games coaching in Boise State. I mean, dude was doing it at Alabama, where the biggest name in college football had been the head coach, Bear Bryant. They don't talk about Bear Bryant no more.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning, you said he did it in the conference that is the SEC. He did it at Alabama, a place where the expectations are kind of insane.
Exactly.
Right? Like, think of it this way. Nick Saban hadn't won a championship in 3 seasons? Is that right? And people were starting to talk about Nick Saban a little bit, like, and not like necessarily that it was like he's a bad coach, but just, well, maybe Nick's lost it. 3 seasons not winning a national
crazy it is.
Title.
It's worse than any other fan base, seriously. And Nick talks about it, and he's got a talk show down there, and he would take phone calls, and he would calmly cuss them out.
And so, but this is the thing, is that's the level of expectation that Alabama always has.
Always.
But it hasn't felt like that because Nick Saban has been so good. And through not just a tough schedule consistently, they've always recruited well. And on top of that, there's been a lot of turnover on those staffs. Just constantly turning these over because people, if you want to get a coach, you might go to one of these consulting firms, but ultimately what they're going to come back with after taking hundreds of thousands of your dollars is going to tell you, hey, hire one of Nick Saban's assistants and it'll probably go well. And that usually does. And then Nick Saban goes and finds another assistant who gets the job done. And there's those things he's had to adjust. Nick Saban always been a defensive guy. And you used to be able to just see that offense just constantly run the damn ball and, grind out games and not do high flying acrobatic things. And he came to a point where he looked up and was like, well, the game has gone to a place where your offense has to modernize, so I will modernize.
He did it at halftime of the game against Georgia with Tua, when he put in Tua over Jalen Hurts. That's when he did it.
Yeah. And
and won the national championship.
There's something to be said for all of these things, and this is just a small part of it. A dude who is an elite recruiter going to anybody's, literally anybody's living room, talk to your mama, charm your grandma, bring you to Tuscaloosa, right?
But you know what? Yeah, I think what pushed him into retirement is this. The portal. He can't control the Wild Wild West. See, that's the Wild Wild West. That's an X factor that not only does he not necessarily have a competitive advantage, you can't tell what's going to happen next. He's 72 years old. He's not 40. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He ain't got time to do all that stuff and try to coach football games too.
I think it's a part of it for sure. Like, the landscape has shifted, and that would be another shift that he'd have to make. And I think he's capable of it, but ultimately there's something to be said for Nick Saban seems to be, in addition to like being a grouch, he seemed to be a grouch because losses gave him an opportunity to coach. He seems to love the profession of coaching and the act of, taking guys and having them grow. Alabama might be the only place in the nation that still kind of has that pipeline of guys come in young and you grow with the program, and you might sit behind somebody, but ultimately that you end up better than where when you came in. And you can't always say that. But even now you're seeing guys transfer out, and I do wonder if he looked around the landscape and was like, the thing that I love doing the most, which is, training up young men to make them better football players, and I imagine better men, it's not as easy to facilitate. But in addition to that, again, he's 72 years old and has done this for 17 seasons at Tuscaloosa. Remember, he did it at LSU before then, right? He's done it other places before then. He has a 51-year head coaching career, coach career in football. And you look around, and who is his peer? He no longer has peers in college football in general because he has done that are like similar age with similar status. They don't exist anymore. And sometimes I wonder if you're like, enough, time to rest. I've done it all.
I think that's part of it. I think that's a major part of it. It's like, again, like I said, the landscape has changed. The portal is in effect. In other words, the guys you're trying to coach up after losses, they'll say F you and they'll go transfer to another school. In other words, the mentality is completely different of players nowadays than just even 5 or 10 years ago. With that being said, like you said, he can't go have a cold beer with a peer because even the coaches are younger nowadays. In fact, I think him doing that Affleck commercial with Coach Prime, that's probably the closest he's come to some coaches that might be his peers. And Deion is not his peer.
No. I mean, also, like, not,
but the perception,
not in age,
you know
really.
What I mean?
And also, yeah. The crazy thing about it is anybody that you could point to as maybe his peer when you talk about winning at a high level, and you look at them and you're like, oh, actually, they're in the next generation or 2 generations off from him. The guys that you would probably look at as maybe his peers in college sports, maybe not just college football, the likes of Krzyzewski, Roy Williams, those, I wouldn't even say Jim Boeheim, but like those guys recently retired. Like, it's about that time in the lifespan where it's time to say goodbye. And the reason why this was shocking was more just because he was still so damn good at it. We didn't have to have the consideration maybe you put him at the pasture. That's how
he wasn't Joe Paterno. Where, he couldn't coach on the sidelines. He's up on the top. I'm not talking about the scandal.
No, I know, but it's so hard to bring up Joe Paterno and not think about that.
Yeah, well, like I said, for those who don't know, Joe Paterno, his last few years, he couldn't even coach on the sideline. He was sitting in a chair in the press box in the coach's booth. And I can even go and say he's not even a Bear Bryant, because when Bear Bryant retired, he died about a month later. Seriously, about a month later, because that's all he did. He was a coach.
Ross. Yes, like
that's just what he coached till he died.
It meant that much to him. I do wonder, like, what the next step is for Nick Saban, because again, there is so many of these guys that make college football their life, and college football, unlike I think any other sport, requires so much of you. Right? There's no off season. CA. You always
exactly.
When the season ends, you are now in somebody's living room trying to get the next crop of young men that are going to sustain the machine that is the college football program that you are running. And so I don't know that immediately translates to we're just going to rest by the lake or anything. So I wonder, can you see a situation where Nick Saban's on TV breaking down these college football games or something?
I can see it. Nothing is ever impossible. And again, you found out that he and Belichick had personality when they did I don't know if it's a documentary, but they did some kind of TV stuff together. Remember that, where they were just telling their stories and they were sitting around talking? I'm like, okay, that's a peer. And Belichick may be joining me because he's probably not going to be back next year. But back to Nick Saban, the question going around everywhere is like, Well, who's going to follow him?
Yeah.
You know, Sark's name is being talked about because he was his offensive coordinator a few years ago. But I don't think anybody wants to be the coach to follow Saban. You want to be the coach to follow the coach that follows Saban.
Well, I feel like you got to take the job, though. Like, and that's the thing. It's you mentioned it, and we always mention it. You're hired to be fired. This feels like one of those where you just kind of got to take the opportunity to go.
But if you're a big name, you can just leverage it. You can get your school to pay you to stay. But if you're a big name, in other words, I'm talking about the biggest names. I'm not talking about a young buck.
Sure,
I'm talking
but
about the biggest names out there. They're not going to follow him.
Depending on where you are, that makes
name a name.
Like Dabo Swinney is one of the people bring up a lot, and I'm like,
because he was an assistant over there.
He's always like Alabama guy. He's always seemed like, but there's something to be said. And there was a recent, like this year, they were a little shaky at one point. And they had the young man call into the program and accost Dabo right to his face, or I guess in a way.
Yeah.
And Dabo, in as nice of a way and as churchy of a way as he can, basically said, "Hey, don't forget where y'all were before I got here." And he has a point in making that statement. Like, Clemson was not this national power.
Sure.
And there's something to be said for the level of clout that gives you and the level of stability that gives you. And I don't know that you give that up for the demands that Alabama gives you, when you can still get, I think, most everything you want there. Now, some of the names that come up are maybe some younger guy. Well, I guess you probably put in a call to Kirby Smart to see if he would want to come. But I feel like that's
Georgia,
the same.
former
Feel like
assistant coach.
You've got the same thing with a lot more buy-in or a lot more equity in the stake when you've won a couple of national titles there at Georgia. But names like Dan Lanning at Oregon, who had previously, he was under Saban at Alabama, then went to Georgia with Kirby Smart, and is now at Oregon running what looks like an SEC program. He's a young guy that's come up. Kalen DeBoer, the head coach at Washington, comes up.
Yep.
James Franklin at Penn State, which I don't know why you put his name in there other than to get him another extension that he probably doesn't deserve. Mike Norvell, Marcus Freeman. Like, there's not going to be a name that's perfect, but I can see some of those younger guys coming in. Dan Lanning seems like a great name because he can build an SEC program, but it all just feels like natural. And let me remind you again, Nick Saban is not immortal in a way when it comes to this college football thing. Mortals in this college football thing will have some level of falter to them, and I just don't think Alabama has the level of time to abide by that. So I feel like whoever comes in is going to be hired to be fired, but you kind of got to do it for the profile.
Listen to this. Notice the name that you didn't mention, and you didn't mention his name because he's sitting at home on a pile of money and don't nobody want to touch him.
Who, Herb? You mean Herb?
No. Jimbo.
Oh. Well, the reason why Jimbo doesn't come up in my mind personally, I don't know. Maybe somebody actually wants to do that. Although I don't know if he has.
No, they don't.
I don't know if he has.
Not
at
Alabama. Come on.
We mentioned with Nick Saban that he had to modernize his offense. That's the exact thing that Jimbo wouldn't do at Texas A&M.
Exactly.
That ended up getting him got.
Yep.
But
like I said, he's sitting on a pile of money. He ain't doing nothing. I bet he might coach some small college or Boise State or something like that just because he likes to coach. But he ain't coaching no big-time program that's going to compete for a national championship no more because, like you said, he's set in his ways and he got a pile of money. If he can't get his way, he'll be comfortable without it. Yeah,
so I found it interesting that you have two guys that are a little older in this thing. And, I mean, not to call people just old. Like 72, they've lived a good amount of life, particularly in this football thing. And also, you talk about peers in the game. Pete Carroll, if he'd stayed in college football, would be one of his peers. And now he is also, in a funny way, on the same day, kind of stepping away from that on-the-field football role. So a couple of guys, high-esteemed football coaches, kind of college football coaches, they're stepping away from the field. Kind of interesting to see on this January 10th, 2024.